Education and mixed research methods. She's a member of the National Academy of Education and the Sociological Research Association and an AERA fellow. Each of our speakers will present a little bit on their own work and their thoughts going forward, and then we will open it up to a Q&A. So, great.
Okay, so thank you, Sarah. I'm delighted to be here, and I'd also like to thank Tom Ketchkamethi from the Academy and Felice Levine from AERA and their staffs who worked very hard over the last couple days to get everybody here and make sure that this event still went on. This panel considers broadly what the educational research community knows today about the causes or the reasons for children's unequal academic outcomes. And I'm going to start us off by asking the question that originally motivated this work over 50 years ago. Are schools to blame for the overwhelmingly unequal academic outcomes for American children? Viewed from a contemporary perspective, this is very much a live question still. Every day, media reports implicate schools and school systems for unequal outcomes, with those media reports citing unequal school financing, crumbling school facilities, and ineffective teachers. Reading these reports, it's easy to imagine a crushingly dysfunctional public school system, one in which schools themselves bring about steep declines in educational outcomes for children, low-income children of color. Others view schools as compensating for the disadvantages of poverty, offering educational experiences better than those typically available to children in their local environments. Discerning the relative truth in these views and ultimately the extent to which schooling writ large contributes to inequality requires reading a research literature that dates back 50 years to the Equality of Educational Opportunity study. Congress commissioned this study, also known as the Coleman Report after James S. Coleman, its lead author, as part of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. The study itself was massive, including 4,000 schools, 66,000 teachers, and almost 600,000 students, one of the largest standalone research efforts ever undertaken in U.S. schools. The study's equally massive final report, which clocked in at over 700 pages, confirmed what many civil rights activists at the time already knew. There was deep race-based inequality on tests of achievement. There were also disparities favoring white children in school resources such as smaller class sizes, school facilities, and the availability of advanced coursework. Surprisingly, however, the Coleman Report showed that these differences in school resources explain very little of the test score gap between white and African American children. In fact, these variables barely even predicted student test scores. Instead, as Felice noted earlier, family background, specifically parental income, education, wealth, and aspirations for children's achievement, proved more influential than the school-based variables. These results set off a seismic shock in the world of education research. Convinced that something must have gone wrong with Coleman's analysis, a large group of scholars started convening regularly at Harvard's faculty club for dinner, drinks, and data analysis. That's how we like to do it at Harvard, in that order, in fact. At the end of the day, however, their collective reanalysis of the 1966 data showed that Coleman's original findings stood. These scholars, however, also pointed out that Coleman's 1966 data was not sufficient to fully answer the question of whether and how schools contribute to academic gaps in the United States. What happened next and continued over the next 50 years was a concerted effort by those scholars and others, including the federal government, that resulted in 4 key advances in the field's capacity to answer this question. One advance occurred around ways to measure school-level factors that might contribute to student academic outcomes. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, scholars found a multitude of new school resources to count, from the types of books in school libraries to the square footage of classrooms. Yet these factors, too, largely failed to explain the between-school differences in children's outcomes. Instead, in the 1990s, a new generation of scholars began to develop measures that tapped the conditions much more proximal to students' outcomes. Things like parent-child interactions, childhood stressors, classroom instruction, and school quality. As our panelists will discuss, many of these metrics do successfully explain differences in child outcomes and have been used to partially explain our achievement gaps. More recently, scholars have found better ways to measure child outcomes, relying less on achievement tests and more on metrics that capture child well-being and later life outcomes, such as school attendance, school engagement, college enrollment, and earnings. A second advance toward answering Coleman's question involved the methods used to model student achievement and excuse me while I become nerdy and technical for a minute. So in the 1980s and 1990s, scholars developed better ways to represent how the layered ecological systems in which kids exist. Kids live within families, they go to classrooms that are within schools, and families and schools exist within neighborhoods. And the goal of this research was to figure out the extent to which each of these levels contributed to child outcomes. The methods developed in this era also allowed us to identify the effects of specific variables within each level of the system. Finally, these methods were adapted to answer questions not only about kids' achievement status, i.e. how well they perform at a single point in time, but also to measure student growth over time. Looking at student growth provides a much more accurate view of the various influences on children's outcomes because scholars can see how that growth or lack of growth on the part of kids correlates dynamically with student and school-level factors that might explain kids' outcomes. The third advance that made answering Coleman's question possible was the development of new federally funded data sets like High School and Beyond and the Early Childhood Longitudinal Study. The latter study collected several waves of data that allowed scholars to answer Coleman's question by making clever use of an artifact of the U.S. school system, summer vacation. Comparing rates of student academic progress when school is not in session, scholars reasoned, to rates of student academic progress when school is in session would allow us to see the difference in how schools deflect children from their natural growth trajectories. With these data sets, the effect of schools on children's growth rates could be identified, and Sean Reardon is going to discuss some of the results of those studies. Finally, pushed in part by the establishment of the Institute for Educational Sciences, scholars began to design and test interventions intended to close the achievement gaps in the United States. These help move the field from correlational evidence, for instance, observing that parent-child reading correlates positively with students' kindergarten readiness, to causal evidence, meaning we're much more sure that when we can increase parental reading to children, that their kindergarten readiness also increases. And Susan Moffett will talk a little bit about the results from some of those studies. In conclusion, there's still many unanswered questions in this field, including how historic structural inequality in the American economy and society contributes to unequal schooling outcomes, and this is an issue that Prudence Carter will take up. However, the field has made steady progress toward answering the questions Coleman laid out over 50 years ago.